Everybody, Saturday night, late night Saturday Night Live. Can't say Saturday Night Live, different show, right? So there's a lot to talk about. New documents came out. Angel, I saw your comment in one of the past videos about other channels not being able to get through the whole document because you kind of get sidetracked, if you try to break down every phrase and every word in the document. I'll do the best I can to make sense of it for everybody tonight and kind of bring everyone back down to earth on what's going on here. So we'll review that document. I did also want to just spend some time, open chat, respond to some comments as well. So keep the comments coming. I'll respond to as many as I can. But so just to start off, just so I know the audience here, how many of you have, watched another video about this new document or these new documents, and how many of you have not? So put a 1 if you have watched another video, and then put a 2 if this is all brand new to you. 1 p.m. in Australia. Welcome, Michelle. Good afternoon. Marietta, 8. It's 9 p.m. where I am. Okay. So, yep. So some people have seen some other videos. Some are new. Great. Yeah. So there's a lot to go through. A lot of these documents are the same. A lot of these documents that were just uploaded to the website are related to the gag order, and I'm not going to get into that too much. I'm not super concerned about that right now. I think they're going to handle that how they're going to handle it, and if we gain access and we're able to have cameras and we're able to see everything, that's great. If they decide later on, we're not able to, then there's nothing we can do about it. We're just going to have to keep track of it another way. For right now, they're going to allow the cameras. The judge is going to reserve the right to change his mind later on. So we have a hearing coming up on Tuesday. Now, this hearing coming up on Tuesday, the 27th, is going to be in regards to some of these filings we're going to talk about right now by the defense. So they're going to have an opportunity to kind of state their case here. So let's take a look here. I'll share some of my thoughts on this, and definitely interested to hear what everybody else thinks about what's going on here. Now, one thing I did notice as well, Angel, is, of course, if you look at other channels, everybody is freaking out right now because there is a reference to, the defense saying that they don't have DNA from the victims in his car, his house, his apartment, etc. And that's fine. But I do think there's still testing. So discovery is still pending in this case. Not, all of the evidence isn't done, signed, sealed, delivered, and packaged up. The evidence here is still ongoing. We're just 6 months into this, and it was December 30th when Bryan was taken into custody. So we're not even 6 months into this. From what I've learned, typical DNA processing in general can take 6 to 8 months. And so this is a very complicated case. There's going to be a lot of DNA to sort through. So I believe that there's still testing going on. So at this point, there may not be any DNA that has been released to the defense in this case. But I do think that the prosecution has been very clear that they are still in the process of discovery, and they'll continue to release that discovery to the defense as they get to it. So I wouldn't read too much into some of these statements that everybody's kind of freaking out about. A lot of this, what's going on here is very standard in what defense teams do to challenge DNA evidence. This isn't anything new going on. Of course, the defense is going to word things to sound favorable to the defense. And so when you see a filing from the defense, you're going to perk up and go, oh, yeah, this sounds like he's innocent. Well, of course, they're arguing his innocence, right? And so that's their perspective here with this motion. So just keep that in mind. You can't, jump to conclusions here because we haven't heard the prosecution's case against Bryan. We don't know the evidence that they have. We've seen bits and pieces. We think we know, but they have a lot more than we know about. And also keep in mind that they stated early on in the case when they were pursuing the warrants and things against Bryan, they stated to the judge that the DNA evidence, they weren't necessarily relying on just the DNA evidence. They have other evidence here. And then, like I've said before, you have to look at all of the evidence as a whole. You have to look at not only the DNA, but the fact that it's on a knife sheath. So the prosecution is also arguing in this, the defense is also arguing in this motion here that there's some additional people's DNA that was discovered in this investigation. And, you know, they mentioned that there's DNA on a glove that was outside of the residence that was found with unknown DNA on it, right? Well, that's a little bit different than DNA on the knife sheath underneath the body of a person who was stabbed to death, right? It's a little different, right? A glove discovered 2 weeks after the crime outside on the road, on the ground, in front of the house by the trash can, has a little bit of a different significance than a knife sheath discovered under the body, right? So you have to look at everything in full context here. You can't get, you know, tunnel vision and drawn into, you know, the defense, you know, challenging the evidence. Well, that's, of course they're going to challenge the evidence, right? But you have to kind of look at this, you know, take a step back and look at everything as a whole when you're talking about the case against Bryan, right? And all of the evidence that the prosecution has. So let's take a look at this document here. And there's a few of them that I want to go through. Again, a few of them are very similar. So Ann Taylor is essentially arguing her case on one document, and then the next document is the official filing for that motion that she's supporting with her declaration. And so it's kind of 2 in 1 there. And then the other is tied in with the others also. And then we have a couple of experts here who are submitting a declaration as well, kind of in support of the defense's challenge of the DNA and their request for some of this genealogy evidence. And, you know, I'll share some thoughts on these people as well, who are kind of, you know, filing this statement, I guess, in the defense's, for the defense here. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So, hey, Writer's Block, good to see you. Paula, Michelle, Lexa, thanks for joining. All right, so there were quite a few documents that dropped here on the 22nd and 23rd. Most of the more interesting ones here were on the 22nd. So the first one I want to take a look at is the declaration of Ann Taylor in support of the defendant's third motion to compel. So they're filing a third motion to compel. So they're requesting discovery from the prosecution. They want insight into the evidence that they have. Okay, so this is their third motion to compel. So we have a back and forth going on here between the prosecution and defense with getting the evidence into their hands, and the prosecution saying they've given them the evidence, and the defense saying that they haven't gotten all of what they've asked for. So they're going to have this back and forth here for a bit. This isn't unusual. They're going to be, you know, with the amount of evidence that there is, I think this is going to take a little while for them to sort it all out, and the judge is going to have to get involved here. This is why we have judges. You're going to have the defense arguing their side. The prosecution has their stance. The judge is going to make a call, and then that'll kind of determine the direction that we go with the evidence in the case and how it all unfolds from here. So Ann Taylor submits this lengthy document here, and she's saying that the counsel has filed a request for discovery related to the DNA in the case. Make sure I'm sharing that for you all. Here we go. And the state filed a response to their request. And the defense is essentially saying here that there's still some things that they've asked for that they haven't received from the prosecution. So request 3 here noted is profiles uploaded to a DNA database. The state, and then she notes here, the state has provided information related to this request for the seized item of the knife sheath only. The defense has requested all DNA profiles, including 3 additional unidentified male DNA profiles developed during the course of law enforcement investigation. This information has not been supplied. So they're saying here that they've learned of additional DNA that was discovered throughout the investigation, and they would like, you know, information about those DNA profiles. And then they said here, the state has not provided all emails, text messages, other messages regarding biological testing in the investigation. Unexpected results and corrective actions. It says this request has been partially complied with. However, they're asking for the full scope of the request, which is 6 months before and after, regarding the testing related to the investigation. And they're asking for information regarding all lab personnel, which they're saying they haven't got. So they want, the facility that did this testing. They want not only the records during the time period of the case, but 6 months before, 6 months after. And they're asking for unexpected results and corrective action. So they're looking for kind of records for this company that processed the DNA, to ensure that there aren't any breakdowns, right, in the way that the DNA is handled and processed and tested. So essentially what they're doing here is they're saying, hey, we've asked for this information, this discovery, and we haven't gotten everything we've asked for. Okay, nothing groundbreaking here. There's nothing unusual here. They're just going back and forth, and the defense is saying, feels that they're entitled to more information, more evidence than they've been given, more discovery than they've been given. The prosecution so far has been saying, hey, we've given them everything, and we're continuing to give them what we have. And so they're just going to have to sort this out. But the thing that has everybody stirred up is some of the wording here in this document. But keep in mind, this is coming from the standpoint of Bryan Kohberger's defense attorney. So there's a few things I want to go over without, going through it word by word. So what the defense is saying here through this section is they've consulted with experts, and these experts have told them that there's more information out there regarding the testing that was done for the genealogy piece of this, the connection where they took the DNA from the knife sheath and connected that to Bryan's family through that public genealogy site. I'll share with you too a little more insight about what appears to be the company that they used to test the DNA. It is mentioned here in one of these documents. So what they're saying here is, hey, we've consulted with experts, and they're telling us that there should be more evidence out there, right, that we're asking for, that we haven't gotten. So that's what's going on here. And then they have these two experts kind of supplying these declarations in support of the defense, saying, yeah, there should be this other evidence out there. So here you have to be careful, right? You have to look at, well, who are these people that the defense has recruited to assist them? And then you look up this person, Bicca Barlow. So she's an attorney, and she's a forensic consultant. She appears to be very qualified, right? She states early on in her notice, whatever this is called, in her declaration here, she cites her qualifications and everything that she's worked on. Well, if you look at the presentations that she's given and the books that she's written, she's always had this kind of standpoint that DNA evidence is disputable. So she's very much involved in challenging DNA evidence. That's her thing, right? That's what she does. And so, of course, this is somebody the defense is going to bring in and have them come and support their argument about fighting against the DNA evidence and the way that it was processed. So this isn't unusual. This is very typical. You'll typically see this in trials, right, where the defense and prosecution, they each have experts who kind of have a background. You have people who kind of believe in these things, and you have the others who dispute them, and they go to these trials and they state their case, and then the jury is influenced, and that's how it unfolds. So Bicca Barlow is the type of attorney who would get up there and testify for the defense, who was trying to dispute DNA evidence. And she would offer professional arguments against the DNA evidence. So she's an expert on how it should be handled and, all of those things in a trial. And then this other person that they're talking about is similar. So they've both kind of written these declarations to the court, citing their credentials, and then supporting the defense's motion here regarding the request for this information around the genealogical testing in the case. And this is what's kind of interesting to me about this is, they're so focused on this genealogical portion of the case with this testing, and they're trying to get ahead of it. They're trying to find, that loophole like we've talked about. But it doesn't, none of this that we read through here negates the fact that Bryan's DNA was on the knife sheath under the body. So all of this stuff, all this legal jargon in these filings is fine, but they still don't answer that question. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to argue that the state pursued Bryan unfairly and they focused in on him and they didn't look into other people, and they picked on him and they singled him out for whatever reason, and that's how he became a suspect, which is completely false. It's ridiculous. It's very simple. And the other thing here is in this document I'm going to show you, Ann Taylor, she says one thing in another filing and then she says another thing in this filing. So previously she talked about how there's so much evidence that they need more time to get through it. There's 51 terabytes of evidence. But in this filing, she's claiming, well, the state doesn't have any evidence against Bryan. So just keep that in mind. These are just people defending Bryan, right? When the prosecution has an opportunity to respond to this, we'll see what they have to say. And then at the trial, we'll see what the case is, the full case, and then that's what really matters, right? The trial is where you determine guilt or innocence. And then there's a few other things to keep in mind with that as well. We had a judge approve a warrant for the arrest of Bryan based off of the evidence that was submitted. And we have a grand jury who indicted Bryan as well on the evidence that was submitted. So there's enough evidence out there to support this indictment of Bryan. A judge independently and a grand jury have both seen more evidence than we have and said, yeah, there's enough there. There's enough probable cause there to go to trial. And then on top of that, the judge initially, when Bryan was arrested, remember, he's being held no bail for a few reasons in a death penalty case. But if you look at Idaho Code 19-2903, it actually says any person charged with it. So as far as no bail, it says any person charged with a crime who is not released on his own recognizance is entitled to bail as a matter of right before a plea or verdict of guilty, except when the offense charged is punishable by death and the proof is evident or the presumption is great. So that's the judge who cited this Idaho code. So the reason that they said no bail is because this is a death penalty case and there is a great amount of evidence for the presumption of guilt. That's how they're able to hold Bryan on no bail. Okay, so there's not just one thing there. There's a whole case here against Bryan, a whole package that we haven't seen yet. So Ann Taylor is arguing her case here, and they're wanting to really challenge the way that law enforcement pursued Bryan and connected Bryan to the case through the genealogy evidence here. And it's interesting because the way that they argue their case, it doesn't really make that much sense to me in some parts of what they're talking about here. Let me take a look at the chat real quick. Go 1:30. It's at 1:30. So Michelle Guest asked what time the case is on. So it's 1:30 Pacific Standard Time in the U.S. Michelle is when it's noted to start. Yeah, exactly, Polly. So it was like, hey, you've given us too much info for us to sort through. And now it's, they have hardly any evidence, right? Which is it? There we go. That's better. Pink says, I guess I'll be up all night. Isn't it? It's morning, I think, where you are, right? But so yeah, so let's jump back over here and we'll look at more at these documents again. And I want to show you what I mean about my thoughts on kind of how, they're contradicting each other. Or they're contradicting themselves. And let me address the part. Here we go. So just backing up. So the defense says, we got the information for the knife sheath, but we didn't get these DNA profiles, including 3 additional unidentified male DNA profiles developed during the course of law enforcement investigation. This information has not been supplied. So the fact that it hasn't been supplied yet doesn't necessarily mean it won't be supplied. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been supplied. It could be in that 51 terabytes of information. We don't know. The state might have a response to this, and they might have an argument against it for some reason. But the fact that law enforcement obtained additional DNA profiles is good for the prosecution, because that shows that they looked into other people. And it's interesting here, because what the defense is going to essentially argue here is they're going to say, we think that the FBI focused in on Bryan and they didn't look into other people. But at the same time, what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, you have these other DNA profiles that you looked into that you haven't given us yet. So they've obviously looked into other DNA profiles. They investigated other people throughout this case. So if the defense is trying to say that they focused in on Bryan, that's not true, right? They looked into many people throughout the investigation. The thing that they're upset about is Bryan got caught. So communications, they're asking for all the text messages, electronic messages. We talked about the unexpected results and corrective actions. So this is the part where they get into the genealogy testing piece, and this is where they kind of contradict themselves. So the state has objected to the request by the defense for all of that genealogy material, and they filed a motion for a protective order. So counsel for Mr. Kohberger requests this court consider the contemporaneous objection to the state's motion and declarations in support of the motion to compel. The discovery is necessary to the preparation of Mr. Kohberger's defense. So they consulted all these experts. The experts supported their argument, and then they filed this motion. And it's their third motion to compel discovery. And they're asking for the additional profiles that were loaded to a DNA database. Well, just a minute ago, they were just saying, that they didn't look into these people. Well, here now they're saying that these unnamed DNA profiles were uploaded to a DNA database, which they were. So they didn't only upload the DNA evidence from the knife sheath and look at Bryan's family tree. They also uploaded additional DNA as well. And the defense is saying here they would like that information. So this is just a recap of what Ann Taylor was mentioning in her declaration. And these are the things that they're essentially saying that they haven't gotten yet. The profiles uploaded to a DNA database. Says the state has provided information related to this request for the DNA on the snap of the knife sheath only. The defense has requested all DNA profiles, including additional profiles developed during the course of law enforcement investigation. Well, wait a minute. I thought you said that they just focused in on Bryan. So now you're concerned with all of these other profiles that they developed during the course of this extensive investigation. You see, see, just because they use fancy jargon here and they push back and they talk in terms that sound favorable to Bryan doesn't necessarily mean it makes sense. So they're wanting the logs and test results of the company that tested the genealogy, did the search and helped the FBI kind of get onto the trail of Bryan and build out his family tree and connect him which then, they later on went and got the trash DNA, connected the DNA from the knife sheath as belonging to a descendant of the DNA from the trash, and that confirmed Bryan as a suspect. That's not what led them to Bryan. They were on to Bryan before the knife sheath DNA came back. They were on to Bryan through the White Elantra early on in November. When they ran his plate, they were on to Bryan November, late November. That's when they started looking into Bryan. And then from there, the genealogy piece supported all of the other stuff like we've talked about. It's all of the evidence. It's the whole package. So this genealogy piece just supported the other stuff they have. So the defense is going to challenge the genealogy testing. And what they're going to say here, there's an interesting part where she says, let me find it here. It's in the objection here. So so just backing up. So Ann Taylor files a declaration. So she's explaining the argument. Then she files the actual motion here of what she explained. And then she files an objection here to the state's motion for a protective order. And this is in regards to the genealogy testing as well. So this is just her responding, right? We saw the prosecution's argument about the protective order, and then this is her response to that regarding the genealogy testing. And this is where it gets interesting here from Ann Taylor. Let me get rid of these other tabs just to clean this up a bit. So through Bryan's attorney, they seek, additional evidence here. And then they cite this factual background. And listen to the wording here. So if you don't believe me about the defense not being aware of how they write things and say things in these documents, if you read the prosecution's description of events, it's going to be, the victims died of stab wounds. But if you read the defense's description of the events, you're going to see a little bit of a softer explanation. So it says here, so this is the defense's statement here. So on November 13th, law enforcement responded to a 911 call, found Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan deceased. No mention of, just deceased. And then they move right on. They don't say of stab wounds or anything. Law enforcement later found a K-bar knife sheath placed next to Miss Mogan on her bed. Placed next to Miss Mogan on her bed. So you can see the wording there implies it was placed there. It implies not that it fell there or it was dropped there, right? So they're very conscious. They're aware of the wording in these documents. And I think they're also very aware of the public having access to these documents. The sheath was placed button side down, partially under Miss Mogan and the comforter. On November 20th, the Idaho State Police Lab located DNA on the button of the sheath and performed STR analysis that led nowhere when ran through CODIS, other than to show the provider was a male. So now, right here is where she lost me, because her statement here is kind of implying that it only showed that. Well, unless you have something to compare DNA to, all you can determine from DNA in itself standalone is if it's male or not, because it will have the Y chromosome, right? So if you don't have something to compare it to, you can't find a match. So when she says here, she words this, and performed this analysis that led nowhere when ran through CODIS. No, there just wasn't a hit. It led nowhere. So you can see the wording there, when ran through CODIS, other than to show the provider was male. That's all they can determine from it standalone. It's not other than to show. That's it. They have to run it through and compare it to something. And then it says, by December 17th, lab analysts were aware of 2 additional males' DNA within the house where the deceased were located, and another unknown male DNA on a glove found outside the residence on November 20th. Okay, so 2 additional people's DNA in the house, unknown. I don't think that's a big surprise, considering all of the, it's well known that they had parties there. People came and went from that house all the time. And so I don't think it's a surprise that there would be additional DNA in the home. I think this is a good thing that law enforcement identified 2 additional DNA sources and investigated those DNA sources and didn't ignore them. It would look a lot worse for the prosecution if they found just one and they didn't even look at anything else and they just went right after Bryan. This is good for the prosecution that they discovered other DNA. They did their diligence and then they investigated that DNA because the defense is asking for the results and for the data regarding that investigation. So how can they argue that they're focusing in on Bryan if they're eliminating other people? It's not their fault that it's Bryan's DNA that was found on the knife sheath. If it was Bryan's DNA on the glove in front of the house and an unknown DNA on the knife sheath, well, now you got something to argue. Now it's like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's not the case here. So 2 additional people in the house that they identified and investigated, okay. And then another unknown male DNA on a glove found outside the residence, which they investigated. You know, where the DNA is found matters here as well. And then they go on to say here, to this date, the defense is unaware of what sort of testing, if any, was conducted on these samples other than the STR-DNA profiles. Okay, well, they did do some testing on it. Unfortunately, it was Bryan's DNA that hit on the knife sheath. So are they supposed to just ignore that? Of course they're going to pursue that. And then they say that these other DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, leading to the conclusion that they don't belong to Mr. Kohberger. I don't know how that necessarily leads to the conclusion of that, but you know, that's fine if there's other DNA and they tested other DNA. I would think they would do that throughout this process. And then this says here, so just remember, so she says again here, while this was ongoing, police were investigating many various possible suspects. So once again, she's admitting that police looked into many people. Many of them provided DNA. At least one had their DNA surreptitiously taken from a discarded cigarette. People had their phones taken and downloaded. So they were looking into people, right? And one area of the investigation had to do with a white sedan seen on a camera located near King Road, first glimpsed by officers on November 18th. By November 25th, police believed the car to be a white Elantra and asked law enforcement to be on the lookout for one. Precisely how the police came to believe the car was an Elantra is still unknown. So this is another false statement by the prosecution here. So you have to be very careful what you believe, everybody. A lot of people out there are going to jump to conclusions here, but here's another just flat out false statement. It says how the police came to believe the car was an Elantra is still unknown. Everybody put a 1 in the comments if you know how law enforcement figured out it was a white Elantra and the year. How many of us know how they did that? We've heard that. I would think most of us. I know Harlot does. How many of us know the way that they identified it as a white Elantra and the year? How did they do it? How did they come to the conclusion that it was a white Elantra, 2014 to 2016 white Elantra? Look at all the ones. Everybody, we all know. Number 1, there's camera footage everywhere. And number 2, they had an FBI expert review the footage. This person is mentioned in the affidavit. Law enforcement officers provided video footage of suspect vehicle 1 to forensic examiners with the FBI that regularly utilize surveillance footage to identify the year, make, and model of an unknown vehicle that is observed by one or more cameras during the commission of a criminal offense. Initially, they thought it was a 2011 to 2013. Upon further review, they determined that it could have been a 2011 to 2016 Elantra. So, does she not know this? Or is she just straight up lying, just saying it? Is she not aware how they determined it was a white Elantra? You had an FBI forensic examiner with 35 years of law enforcement experience, 12 years working at the XBI, who has specific training that includes identifying unique characteristics of vehicles, and he uses a database that gives visual clues of vehicles across states to identify differences between vehicles. That's how they figured it out. It's not a mystery. So once again, it's a false statement here by the defense. We all know how they identified it. They're just mad that he got caught. The white Elantra led them to Bryan. They started looking for white Elantras. Those officers located the white Elantras. They matched the name. They had the DNA. The DNA ran through a database. They came up with the name there as well later on that matched Bryan. Then they went and got the trash DNA, which matched to Bryan's dad, and they figured out that whoever left the DNA on the knife sheath was the descendant of Bryan's dad. And then once they arrested Bryan, then they took his DNA, which was a direct match to the DNA on the knife sheath. So they know how police came to believe it was an Elantra. And it says a report from an analyst for the FBI dated March 21st shows the analyst heavily relying on a video of a car heading in the wrong direction and at the wrong time on Ridge Road. So they're focusing in on probably one piece of evidence that this analyst maybe, wrote a report on, and maybe one video in that video footage, yet they say they don't have any evidence. And this is from March 21st. That has nothing to do with the way they identified the vehicle early in the investigation back in November. There's other video footage out there. Just because, there could be a mismatch in which video was being referenced, it doesn't matter. It's a white Elantra. It's a white sedan. Even if it's not an Elantra, even a white sedan, and they ran it and they checked Elantras by happenstance, and then it led them to Bryan. What does it matter? That's it. Police investigation work, right? That's what police do. They investigate. They follow clues and leads. And then that's how they find a suspect. And then they link the suspect, right? They find the evidence that fits. And they either determine that they didn't do it, or they figure out if they did, right? That's kind of how it goes. They were looking for white Elantras. The white Elantra led them to Bryan Kohberger. All the other stuff just kind of secured it, right? It reinforced the suspicion once they identified him. They had already identified him. The DNA and those things later on that connected him came after he had been identified. So then they say the state's latest filing admits that somewhere within all of this, they engaged in investigative genetic genealogy using the DNA taken from the button on the sheath, and now claims that it was due to the use of this technique that it tipped law enforcement to investigate Mr. Kohberger. It remains unclear what the police first relied on in focusing their investigation on Mr. Kohberger. No, it's not. That's another false statement. It's right here in their affidavit. It says exactly how they became focused on Bryan Kohberger. It explains it in detail. Read the affidavit. I put it, everybody, I linked the document site here in the description of this live, so you can check it out if you want to go. But just, it's right at the top, the affidavit there. Read through it. They explain exactly how camera footage of the white Elantra and phone pings, and then these officers identifying a white Elantra, identifying the white Elantra matching to Bryan Kohberger. They explain the whole process here. They say the state apparently thinks that they need not explain how they came to think it was Mr. Kohberger's DNA on the sheath. Think it was? I'm pretty sure it was 1 in 5.37 octillion that it's his. And it says, presumably the defense is expected to accept at face value that the sheath had touched DNA just waiting for testing by all the FBI's myriad resources. Yeah, he left it there with his DNA. It was just sitting there. Yes. And then they say the defense is to guess whether the state focused on its investigation on Mr. Kohberger via a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment or through its faulty identification of the vehicle involved in this case. Faulty identification. I don't care if they said it was a 2005 Honda Civic, white Honda Civic. And then later on they said, oh yeah, they happened to find this guy and it was a white Hyundai Elantra. Oh, yeah, pretty darn close, right? It was a grainy video. They couldn't quite tell. But they were looking for a white car and it led them to the suspect. Good enough, right? As long as you have the other evidence to support it, the route they took to identify him, as long as they didn't violate his rights or anything, I don't understand, what their argument is about the make and year of the vehicle and the way it was identified. Again, focusing on one piece of evidence, you have to look at all of it together. It's not just one thing alone. So they're arguing that the defense, the defense is arguing that the prosecution is trying to hide this evidence. They don't want them to see the investigation into Bryan's family tree. At one point, they even say that, it could potentially even be somebody else in Bryan's family. How, it wouldn't necessarily narrow you down to Bryan, but it would only narrow you down to maybe additional people in Bryan's family, kind of trying to, maybe imply that somebody else in his family, a distant relative or something, could have been responsible. But it still, like I said earlier, doesn't explain away the idea, the fact that his DNA is on the knife sheath and they ran his direct DNA and it matched. So the genealogy process and all that, they can argue that all they want, but his DNA still matches what they found at the crime scene. Not in front of the house, on the ground, on a glove by a trash can. Inside the house under the body, his DNA was there. Still doesn't explain that. Now they're going to try to argue that it was contamination or something as to how it got on there. So it just happened to be his DNA that got on there and contaminated, and all the other stuff that points to his guilt, the video footage, that's all a coincidence. Everything's a coincidence, right? White car, phone pings, DNA. It's all a coincidence. So they're just arguing that they have reason to be suspicious of the investigation. They want this information because they want to be able to determine if the investigation was sound. They want to make sure that they didn't focus in just on Bryan. And they're just kind of implying that, they didn't do their diligence in the investigation. But at the same time, they're saying that they want information of these other people that they investigated. So you tell me. But, everybody don't jump too much ahead on this stuff. Of course, a defense motion here, they're going to have the stance, and it's going to have the tone of arguing against, the state's case against Bryan. We don't know that case against Bryan. The prosecution isn't going to come out and tell us that. So this is just kind of part of the proceedings here. They're going to have to work this out with the discovery and what evidence is released, back and forth. The judge will get involved. They'll figure it out. I think there's still some testing going on. I really think, this mention of the DNA. Now, it might be true. Maybe there is no DNA. Maybe they didn't find any, and that's possible. Bryan had time to clean up if he did it, right? So it's possible that they didn't find any of the victim's DNA. So, but it's also possible that they are still testing a lot of that DNA and the results aren't back yet. So that discovery hasn't been shared with the defense yet. We don't know. What we do know, though, is there is something out there solid, because we had a judge and a grand jury both agree that there was probable cause to arrest Bryan and to charge Bryan and send this to trial. So whatever the entire package is that was delivered to them supports it in pretty strongly, overall. So we just have to wait and see at trial, and then we're going to learn a lot here, I hope, on Tuesday after this hearing, when they kind of have a chance to talk to the judge about it. And then the judge probably, if I had to bet, he probably isn't going to make a decision on the spot on Tuesday, kind of similar to these last rulings. It'll probably be a week or so before we hear anything. But and then we'll see what he says as far as the what the prosecution's going to give the defense, and we'll see how they work it out. But again, the defense is just saying, hey, we have been asking for this, we want this additional information, and then they state their argument here. And that's what it is. Let's take a look at the chat. Yeah, I had actually initially set this live up to kind of hang out and just kind of chat with everyone, and then these new documents loaded, so it was good timing. Yeah, Stacy, it's the crooked cops. I mean, there's a lot of speculation and theories out there, and that's fine. I think at the end of the day, I still think they have plenty of evidence here. I don't think that this motion from the defense, has a ton of merit. I think they're kind of grasping for things here. They're trying to challenge this DNA any way they can. And that's the other thing actually I wanted to share. I mentioned this isn't anything new necessarily, but if you look at for example, this is just kind of like a law firm site here, but challenges to admissibility and overcoming objections. So I mentioned those experts that are supporting the defense with their declarations. So you have all kinds of experts out there who challenge DNA and the way it's handled, all of those things. And then you have companies who do the processing who are trained on how to do it right to avoid these breakdowns and loopholes and things that the defense would leverage. So that's just kind of how it goes. So, but if you look here, like I said, this isn't any big surprise what's going on, but things that defenses will typically challenge are bad sampling. So crimes do not usually happen in sterile environments. DNA from individuals other than the person or persons who committed the crime can easily contaminate crime scenes. Additionally, law enforcement officers who mishandle evidence could introduce contamination. Sound familiar? It's exactly what the defense is saying here. This is what they're trying to imply. To overcome this challenge, the prosecution or defense may need to produce evidence that documents proper handling procedures or proves why a match is likely accurate even though contamination might be present. So this is normal. This is kind of the angle of attack. Lack of supporting evidence. So this is what I mentioned. DNA evidence by itself is not usually sufficient. Let me make sure I'm sharing. Yeah, there we go. Is not usually sufficient to prove that someone did or did not commit a crime, right? That's true. For example, when a suspect's DNA matches samples from the crime, the defense can try to prove that the suspect could not possibly have been at the crime scene when the crime occurred. In such case, DNA evidence may not be enough to secure a conviction. To overcome this, the opposition must present supporting evidence. For example, the prosecution could use video from a surveillance camera that shows the suspect at the crime scene to prove that the suspect had access to the scene when the crime occurred. So that's really key, right? So if they're going to try to argue the DNA evidence, it's not just that. In addition, they have more supporting evidence to put him there. So that gets you a little bit closer to, you could say, well, the knife sheath doesn't necessarily prove he killed him. It could prove somebody dropped it there, all those different things. But when you add him being there on camera, his phone pinging there as well, those all support it together. Improper lab analysis. So this is exactly what the defense is also challenging. Labs handle many samples. And if personnel does not follow proper procedures, mistakes with the storage, labeling, or analysis of evidence can occur. Labs can overcome this challenge by presenting documentation that proves the lab followed the proper procedures. So this is very common stuff here that's going on. This isn't any big groundbreaking document that is, proving guilt or innocence. Either way, this is a back and forth regarding the evidence in preparation for the trial and for the defense. Now, here's the company that it appears was used in the investigation. It's called Othram. It's referenced here by Ann Taylor, I believe, in her declaration here. Let me grab this. Well, you're just going to have to take my word for it. But she references this company, Othram. I don't know how to say it. But this is the company, I looked it up, that it appears is the company that may have been utilized to investigate Bryan and kind of put together the family tree. So let's just clarify really quick the way it unfolded, right? It was knife sheath DNA was being looked at. Whitey Lantra was being looked at. Bryan Kohberger was matched to the Whitey Lantra. Knife sheath DNA uploaded into database. Database found a match to a family tree. They were investigating Bryan. They went to his house. They got the trash DNA. The trash DNA tested against the knife sheath, found that the knife sheath DNA was biologically connected to the trash DNA, i.e. Bryan's dad. Then, once Bryan was arrested, the swab from his cheek was a direct match to the knife sheath. Okay, it all was all a process connecting together. So they're trying to break that up. They're trying to attack the investigation. But Othram looks like the company here. It says 21st Century Forensics. They have a mission statement. But they, you can go here and upload DNA, and they will process it for you. They work with law enforcement all the time. It says here, Othram uniquely offers in-house processing of evidence from DNA extraction, enrichment, and repair to sequencing and genealogy. Our lab supports chain of custody and is staffed by seasoned forensic DNA analysts with experience testifying in court. Okay, so like I said, this company has people who know how to process the DNA, and so we would assume that they did handle the DNA properly, we would hope. So this would be the company here. But, and when you talk about, arguing, there are so many cases being solved through really tiny amounts of DNA right now. And, you can see this company right here is pretty legit. They've got quite a few cases under their belt here where they're working with multiple police departments here. So I would imagine that they have some expertise in this field and how to handle evidence. A lot of these are cold cases that they're solving, but there's quite a long list here. You can see of cases that this company's been involved with. So based off of this document that Ann Taylor found, where she mentions this, because there was a New York Times article, and she mentions how, let me find that really quick. Here it is. So Ann Taylor says, I'm aware of specific news reports in this case regarding Mr. Kohberger's DNA as published by the New York Times on June 11th, that FBI personnel worked with the profile that Othram had produced, spending days building out a family tree that began with distant relatives. So she mentions this Othram company here as being the one that built out the family tree. So more to come. I'm glad that Tuesday is right around the corner, and I really hope they show it on camera like the last hearing. It sounds like we should be able to see it. So I'll definitely be on Tuesday to talk about that. So keep an eye out for that. We'll watch that and it's all the way through, and then discuss that together. So it's fine. I mean, they have a right to to ask for this evidence and to argue their case and have this back and forth. That's how this works. I wouldn't necessarily jump to every filing from the defense and jump to conclusions here. This is going to be a pretty drawn out case, in my opinion. So I think this is just going to be, there's going to be other documents that are going to be released down the road that are probably going to have similar stuff that, you know, you just have to kind of look at everything in context and as a whole, not kind of focus in on one piece here. So let me get this off the screen. We'll check out the chat. Saturday night. Sunday morning, I think, for some people. Chat's gone a bit wild. Yeah, thanks LH for keeping an eye on the chat. Everybody hit the like for our moderator, LH. She does a really good job. Yeah, I know, the chat's blowing up. It should be. It's very controversial. This case, right? This case has hit a nerve with so many people. Yeah, Lynn, I do. I think this case is gonna kind of, work itself out. They're gonna have to, right? That's why we have judges. The judge is gonna make a ruling on these things, and it's gonna be very interesting. This is, I've said before, I think this is gonna be a really groundbreaking case, in a few different ways. The digital evidence, I think it's gonna come back around, and that's gonna also be something that we're gonna see potentially challenged by the defense in a very similar way. But even just with the DNA evidence and the way that this case unfolds, I long time ago in some really old videos of mine, I talked about the Danielle Van Dam case and the way the insect forensic, evidence was a huge part of that case, years ago, like in 2000 or so. And I think like this is going to be a case very similar, where this is going to be one where the experts are going to be really key, the ones who are testifying here in supporting, either side. Sunday in 5 minutes. Always good to see you, Brian. Judge, yep. Yeah, Angel, good point. Yeah, little sarcastic. Yeah, if anybody wants to read through it again, it's linked in the description of this video, so you can check it out after, if you want to read all the way through. But yeah, a little bit, again, it's very, I almost wonder how aware are they of, who gets to read these documents and their perception. And, that's their job, is to defend Bryan Kohberger. That's what they're doing. Definitely, Brian. So, don't focus in too much on one piece. Keep in mind there's a lot more that we don't know about. We don't know the case the prosecution has, that whole package. 51 terabytes of information is a lot of information. There's got to be, some footage out there, I would imagine. I wonder if the defense hasn't even had a chance to get through it all yet either, and there could maybe be some confusion on this, where they're saying they haven't gotten certain things, and maybe the prosecution thinks they gave them certain things. It could be confusion on either side. They're just going to have to work it out. Yeah, Sasha, I agree. It's strange to me that they kind of are challenging the investigation, because it doesn't feel to me like the investigation was off in any way. It felt like it flowed pretty well. They got a tip about a white car, wherever that tip came from. They started looking at white cars, and then that led to this person named Bryan Kohberger, and then they started looking at that person, and unfortunately for Bryan Kohberger, it led to these connections with him, right? Other people were also found and investigated, and it didn't lead to these connections. Yeah, man, Idaho is got some big cases, right, Alexa? We had the Daybell and now this one going on. Probably not what they want to be known for in Idaho. I know that. But everybody, yeah, keep the comments coming. Let me know what you think. These are my opinions on kind of what's going on here. So. Yeah, I thought they did a good job. They got a lot of flack. The other thing I wanted to do in my next live coming up, maybe just we'll see how this thing goes on Tuesday. But in the next one or two of my lives here, I do want to look back at the that press conference right after the arrest. Because there's something I wanted to talk about from that I think a lot of us have forgotten about, and I think it'll just be a fun one to take a look at together again. Had some talking points on it. So Consuelo says, "Why wait so long to make the 911 call?" So we don't know. I have talked about that in some past videos. I've got a video up with one theory around shock. Now, the other thing is, keep in mind, there's not necessarily just one answer for the entire period of time. And I don't know, is it a full 8 hours, say 4:30 to, they say 11:30, so about 7 hours, I don't know. But there doesn't necessarily have to be one explanation. There could be a combination of things that occurred in that time frame, and we don't quite know. Now, there are people who know. Dylan knows, Bethany knows, law enforcement knows. I think the Gonsalves family has a pretty good idea what occurred that morning, and they don't seem to be super upset about things. In fact, Steve Gonsalves said if he saw the two surviving roommates, he would give them a hug, and he appreciates what they're going for, actually were the words out of his mouth, I thought that was very interesting, because I do think that they're going to be key witnesses, of course, right, in this trial. And so they're just the beginning of this as well. They still have a road ahead of them of having to get through the trial and testify as, being victims in this case. They still have to get on and explain what happened, right? And probably be questioned by the defense. So that's still on their mind right now. Angel says, "What happened to the search for some delivery van, the UPS?" There was some camera footage they were looking for, Angel. We didn't hear back what it was, but that could be part of the terabytes of information that they've turned over. There could be some footage there. It could just be as simple as they were just doing a canvas, and UPS trucks have GPS, things like that. So for whatever reason, they wanted to look at that lead and get that camera footage of what could have been out there. I mean, I remember this last winter when we were all watching the case from the very beginning. I mean, they were digging right into this case. They were really trying to find this person. We all were just on edge. Everybody who knew the victims was being looked at. So it's interesting to me now that the defense is trying to claim that they just focused in on Bryan, when for the first 3 weeks of the investigation, it was everybody else, around them that everybody was examining. There we go. Got my chat fixed. Yeah, Angel, the delivery vans. I don't think it was mail they were looking for. I think it was some camera footage. Yeah, so PK says the defense states that there is no victim DNA in the car, right? That's what they're saying, right? And they may not have that right now. That could still be being processed at this point. There was a lot of things that the defense stated in these documents that I just went over that were incorrect, and so it wouldn't surprise me that might be incorrect, or just I don't think the evidence has fully been processed. We're just hitting 6 months with the amount of evidence I think that they're having to sort through. I think it's going to take a little longer than that, because the prosecution's also said they're going to continue to provide discovery as they get more evidence. I agree, Marietta, regarding Brent. Brian says he thinks Brent did the actual killing. So maybe two of them, Brian? I still don't know if that would be good for Brian, though, because he would still be connected here. Yeah, Sasha says, I'm curious what people would do if this was happening right next to them. Yeah. Yeah, the only thing, Brian, is with the video footage, they describe it and stuff. Yeah, we just, without seeing the actual footage and all that, it's hard to say exactly where it may have been. Yeah, so the original Alexa says Brent has nothing whatsoever to do with the case. It just happened to make the news during the hunt for BK and Pullman. Yeah, it's in the area. Yeah, Pink, I agree. Will definitely be interesting to see what happens on Tuesday. I can't wait for that. I'm glad it's not weeks out. I'll check it out, Brian, for sure. Yeah, so it'll be interesting. I'll definitely be on that night, and we'll talk about that. I think I'll do, kind of get it. I'll play it, and I think I got all my streaming buffering stuff figured out, so that might run smoother for us, and we can chat about it while it plays. Thanks, Brian. I will schedule it, Pink. Yes. Yeah, Harlot says he drove by a lot of people's houses and apartments. That's a great point. Yeah, he did. It is strange, that night too. He kind of looped around and came in. He passed the home and then he circled back around. Drove around for a while, right? Kind of driving through neighborhoods and things like that. They had him on camera from about 3:29 up until after the crimes, and then right after near the apartment. So he was all over the place. So Sasha says, "What did happen with Kopaka? Why did he do that? We don't know. They haven't released it. He had some struggles with PTSD. There were some statements that he was holding his roommates and threatening them. We don't know what triggered him. Um, we don't know if that's even true, what was happening, or if it was a misunderstanding. But there was this kind of standoff at the apartment. It is an interesting situation. It's in itself, even if it's not connected to this case with the Idaho 4, just in itself with Brent Kopaka, that situation was sad, and the way it unfolded, there's still questions there. Why haven't they released the 911 call? So just, yeah, I can understand why Brian is saying, has some thoughts there on, could there be some sort of connection there? I don't know, just from what I've seen there, but I can understand, but why, because there are questions that haven't been answered about Brent Kopaka. He, he may not have been threatening his roommates. That, from what I researched about Brent Kopaka, he was a really nice guy and was very, loyal to his friends, and, wasn't that type of person. And then, here they say he was doing that, but then they were just let go and they weren't harmed in any way. So we don't really know what happened and why and how it all unfolded with him. Marietta says Rory was verbally attacked in Moscow yesterday at Corner Club. Who's Rory? Angel says. Writer's Block says, I love how vested we all are. As dark as this whole thing is, it gives me hope the society cares about justice and keeping our kids safe. Yeah, I think, yeah, this case, you know, I don't know if any of us know, but for whatever reason, it definitely has touched all of us in different ways. You know, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the mystery. You know, I think it's all different things that plays into it. You know, you have the mystery behind how it happened. You have these victims, right, that just seem like such nice kids. I say kids. I know they're not kids, but I say kids because they were so young and they were, you know, had their whole life ahead of them, and then it's just taken away. And you know, you had the whole investigation early on and all these suspects, and there was all this evidence to review, right, with the camera footage of the food truck. So you know, we were all just kind of intrigued by trying to figure out what happened and who could have done it. And then it just, you know, then they had a suspect, and then it all shifted right into kind of, you know, looking into that angle and trying to figure out how it could have happened with him being the suspect. And definitely a wild case. Yeah, Brian, email it to me. Send it over. All right, everybody. So I think I'm going to wrap up tonight. And like I said, keep an eye out. Definitely going to be on Tuesday. I won't be on tomorrow, but Monday night I should be able to get on. So we'll do a Monday night and a Tuesday night. And Pink, I'll definitely get those scheduled ahead of time. I'll work on that right after this video. So again, the documents are linked in the description if anybody wants to look at those any closer, and then reach out to me if anytime, everyone, if you see something in there that you want to talk about that I didn't mention here, and any insights you have, I'm definitely interested in hearing. I will talk to you all on Monday, and thanks again for being here tonight. See you then.